Are you sure you're living right? I wasn't. Not when it came to my father. Hi, I'm Clara Bennett from Denver, Colorado. If stories about family, second chances, and the quiet ways love shows up mean something to you, I'd be honored if you'd stick around. And if you want more like this, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Today's story is called, My Brother Was Always the Favorite, but when Dad died, I learned I was the only one he trusted. You might hear that title and think you know the ending. I thought I did, too. My brother Michael was the sun in our house, bright, loud, and impossible not to notice, while I was the cool side of the moon. You don't stare at the moon. You glance and move on. That's what I believed about myself for most of my life, a glance and move on. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you've stood in a kitchen doorway while someone you love by blood loves someone else by habit. Maybe you've learned how to smooth your own edges so you don't scrape the people who look right past you. Our home was a modest split level with creaky stairs and a porch that needed repainting every spring. The kind of house that makes you think of measuring a child's height on the wall with pencil marks and then never painting over those lines because you can't bear to erase time. We lived a few blocks from a little park where the grass browned early and the swings squeaked high and thin. Denver sun in summer can bleach any color into pale memory. Winters paint everything with a kind of chastity. Between those seasons, my father lived his cycles of effort, always fixing something, always tightening a bolt, always adding an extra hour on the job because overtime was the only way he knew how to do care. Dad wasn't cruel. He was, in the language of men his age, steady. He ate the same breakfast, wore the same belt, kept the same unbent rules. If he loved you, he showed it by making sure your tires had the right pressure and your front door locked without sticking. When he spoke to Michael, a different kind of weather moved through him, gusts, crackle, lightning. When he spoke to me, it was mostly forecast. Drive safe. Be home by 10. You good on gas. He asked me the questions that made sense to him, not the questions I wanted. He never asked, Are you scared? Or, Do you feel beautiful today? Or, What's the song stuck in your head this week? These were the questions I asked myself and answered in silence. Michael was a pitcher. That's one way to say it. Another is, Michael was a miracle that everyone saw. He threw fastballs that cut the air clean. People clapped and you could feel the clapping all the way home. Boys rode their bikes after us and shouted his name. Girls wrote it on notebook covers. Coaches shook my father's hand like they were buying a new car. You must be proud, they said. My father's face arranged itself into pride like a well-worn suit. I am, he said. He didn't look at me when he said it, and truthfully, I didn't look at him. I learned young how to pretend pride was contagious. Once, in 7th grade, I won a citywide essay contest. The prize was a ribbon and a gift card to a bookstore on Colfax. I wore a red dress because my mother said it would pop on stage. After the ceremony, they took a picture of the winners. I held my ribbon like a lifeline. Dad didn't come. He had a double shift. I told myself I didn't mind, that jobs put food in our mouths and shoes on our feet, and who was I to resent something as ordinary as duty? That night when Dad came home, I left the ribbon on the kitchen table under the salt shaker. The next morning, it was gone. I found it in a drawer with rubber bands and spare batteries. Healthy families keep what matters in frames. We kept it near paper clips. In high school, Michael's games became rituals. Friday nights, stadium lights, streaming breath in September air. Dad leaned on the fence down the first base line and chewed toothpicks in sequences that matched the innings. Turn 2, he'd say into the wind. Paint the corner. These were the phrases that made them both feel understood, but language is strange. There are dialects even within households. My father spoke baseball to my brother. He spoke maintenance to me. How's the Civic running? You check the oil. The house would look nicer with fresh mulch. pH balance and spark plugs and mulch. You can say you're loved by the way someone looks at your car. Another memory, a winter afternoon when the sky over Denver was clear as glass. I'd been practicing a piano piece for weeks. Debussy, ripples of sound, light on water. The recital hall was small, the kind where coughs echo and you can hear the hum of the old radiator. I could pick out my mother's face in the second row, hands clasped, mouth soft. 2 seats beside her sat empty. Dad and Michael had a scrimmage that ran long. I played that day like it mattered, and it did, but not in the way I wanted. When the applause came, it felt like snow, quiet pretty, gone the second it touched the ground. Afterward, I pressed my forehead to the cold window in the foyer and watched the sky. Mom came up behind me, put a hand on my shoulder, and used the tone mothers use when they're covering for someone. "Your dad tried," she said. "He really did. It's hard to explain the exact shape of a wound that comes from being nobody's favorite. It's not dramatic enough for cinema. It's a slow hunger. It's learning how to swallow your own name. It's becoming self-sufficient not because you are brave, but because you have to be. You're so independent." People told me like it was an award, but independence can be a room with no handles on the inside. By the time I turned 32, life had settled into a rhythm. I rented a 1-bedroom near Cheeseman Park with a slanted floor and plants that I always meant to water. I worked at a small marketing firm downtown, the kind where everyone brings their personality to the office like a pet, enthusiastic, sometimes messy, reliably needy. I liked the work. I liked the quiet of writing copy that sounded like someone else, the way I could climb into a brand voice and forget my own for a while. Most days I walked home. In winter, the city glowed with the kind of cold that makes every breath a visible vow. I'd pass the coffee shop where the barista spelled my name wrong in new, inventive ways. Clara, Clara, Cara. It always made me smile. It's a small thing, a name, but even small things make you look around for someone who knows how to spell you right. At home, I kept a box of the letters and notes people had written me. Not many. A poem from a friend in college, a post-it from my mother, stuck to a bag of groceries she dropped off when I had the flu. "Soup is in the freezer. Your dad says add water if it's too salty." Even the love in our house had instructions attached. Meanwhile, Michael did what favored sons do. He rose. A baseball scholarship turned into minor league ball. Minor league ball turned into the kind of local fame that bought you a booth at the nicer diner and the sense, perhaps unconscious, that if the world were a card game, you'd been dealt face cards. He posted photos with teammates, glossy with sweat and camaraderie. He dated a girl whose teeth looked like she'd been born at a dentist's convention. He came home for holidays with stories that sat high on the table, stories that asked you to climb up and admire the view. Dad listened like a man who'd paid good money for a front row seat. We tell ourselves the story we can stand. Mine was that Dad had chosen a son he could understand over a daughter he didn't know how to read. That let me be angry without being cruel. It let me love him without being naive. It also let me stay away. Our phone calls were weather reports. "How's work?" "Fine. Snowed there yet?" "A little." "You good on gas?" "Yes, Dad." Always with the gas, as if the only thing that could make me stuck was an empty tank. I never said, "My tank is empty in other ways." The thing about becoming your own rescuer is you forget how to signal for help. If you're listening and thinking, "That was me," then you understand the choice people like us make. We become competent. The world doesn't give medals for surviving family dynamics, but it does hand out promotions to people who show up early and stay late and never need a pep talk. Somewhere along the way, competence became my costume. I wore it to work, to dinner, to sleep. It protected me. It kept me from feeling how badly I wanted to walk into a room and be someone's favorite anything. There were cracks, of course. One Thanksgiving, Michael arrived late with roses for Mom and a new watch for Dad and a hug for me that smelled like another woman's perfume. The table was heavy with food and with something else, expectations maybe. Dad carved the turkey like a man performing a sacred rite. To Michael, he said when we lifted our glasses, for a great season. He didn't mean harm. He was simply telling the truth he knew how to tell. When I set my glass down, it left a ring. I wiped it with my sleeve. Mom saw me and touched my wrist, so lightly that if I had turned my head, I might have missed it. There are 10,000 ways to say, I see you. We use very few of them in time. Later that night, while Dad and Michael watched highlights and the television narrated applause, I stood at the back door and looked out at the yard. The frost had come early and painted the grass into something brittle. I thought about how people call it favoritism, as if it's always intentional, as if parents choose with malice. Sometimes favoritism is just the river that runs through a family, carving the path of least resistance. The son who plays the game Dad understands. The daughter who plays music he doesn't. The river doesn't ask your permission. It just goes where it can. If the story ended there, if all I did was catalog injuries and call it a memoir, it would be simple and, I guess, satisfying in a way that anger can be. But life is rarely a straight line. It's more like the old roads in Colorado, the ones that climb mountains in circles and show you the same view from different heights until something finally changes, and you don't know if the new view is the road's fault or your eyes. In January, the air in Denver grew very still, as if the city were holding its breath. I started getting up early to walk before work, to listen to my boots make the same sound against the same cracks in the same sidewalks. I thought of Dad sometimes, how he used to get up before dawn, how the coffee machine in our old kitchen would answer the quiet with a kind of determined hiss. He liked the world better before it woke up. Less traffic, he'd say. He meant it literally. There were fewer cars on the road, but he also meant it the way men mean many things beneath the surface. Less traffic, fewer people to disappoint, fewer conversations he didn't know how to have. One morning, frost printed itself on my scarf. I stopped in front of a bookstore and pressed my palm to the glass. Inside, the lights were off, but the books glowed in the faint pre-dawn, spines like a choir of secret keepers. And a strange thought came to me, uninvited, soft as dust motes. What if my father's silence wasn't a verdict? What if it was a language I didn't understand yet? You don't change your mind about your father in a single epiphany. You gather small moments like coins in a jar, and one day the jar is heavy enough to mean something. Mine started filling with tiny observations I'd ignored. The way Dad always checked the porch light before bed, not for his own sake, but because he believed light kept the world honest. The way he folded the dish towels the same careful way, as if order could bless a day. The way he paused before he spoke to people, measuring words like carpenter's cuts, slow, exact enough. I didn't tell anyone about these thoughts. You learn to keep your private revolutions private until they are finished. But a person can feel it when you begin to reconsider them. The next time I visited home, Dad looked at me longer than usual, as if he had noticed a new doorway and wondered if he should walk through. We sat at the kitchen table with mugs that had seen more years than Michael's trophies, and he said, "You need snow tires." "I know," I said. "I'll get them." We were who we were. But for the first time, I heard in his advice a kind of offering. I can't ask if you're lonely, but I can ask if your road is safe. I can't tell you you're my favorite, but I can tell you the world is slippery and I don't want you to slide. If you were expecting a big scene in this first chapter, a confrontation, a declaration, some cinematic proof of favoritism, you'll have to wait. The truth of our family unspooled slowly in polite rooms over polite meals under polite weather. In our house, Loyalty was measured by who showed up for the boring parts. My father excelled at boring parts. He loved things that needed fixing. If I had known then what I know now, I might have brought him my heart sooner, squeaking, in need of oil. But we don't get to retrofit our childhood with adult wisdom. We only get to tell the story better the second time. So this is my second telling. If you felt invisible growing up, if you learned how to wrap your hunger in competence, if you were never anyone's favorite, stay with me. The night my father died, the story I'd rehearsed for 3 decades collapsed in one breath. But death is not the only thing that undoes a family. Sometimes trust does. Sometimes love, the quiet kind, changes all the math. I didn't know yet that I was the only one he trusted. I didn't know what that trust would ask of me. I didn't know how it would both heal and break me all over again. For now, hold this picture. A daughter at a window after a recital, watching a winter sky, a father at a ballpark fence watching a son. 2 lines that never meet, or so I thought. The rest of this story is how those lines finally crossed, and if pieces of this echo in your own life, if there's a room in your memory where you still feel 12 and unseen, don't leave yet. There's more to say. There's a will to be read, letters to be found, and a kind of trust that feels like a key placed in your palm with the instruction. It was always yours. This is chapter 1. Stay with me. The wound is only the beginning. The trouble with comparisons is that they rarely need words. They hum in the background in gestures, in the way an eye lights up at one child's success and dims at another's. They live in the pauses between sentences, in the sighs after phone calls, in the clink of a fork against a plate when the topic changes. If you grew up with a golden sibling, you know what I mean. The crown sits on their head, and somehow the weight presses on yours. Michael wore his crown easily. I don't even think he noticed it was there. That was the cruelest part. How natural it seemed for the world to hand him things I could only reach for on tiptoe. From little league to college applications, he moved as though doors had been propped open just before he arrived. And Dad, he walked right behind him, carrying the pride like a torch. I remember one particular afternoon in high school, the kind that brands itself into your memory not because it was spectacular, but because it crystallized everything you feared was true. I had stayed late for a debate club meeting. I wasn't the best debater, but words were my sport, and I worked hard to make them count. That night our team had won the regional round. I came home with a certificate rolled into a tube, tied with a red ribbon. Mom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew, the scent of rosemary filling the room. She smiled wide and asked about the competition. I unrolled the paper, held it like a banner, and she kissed my cheek. Dad came home 10 minutes later, car tires crunching on the gravel driveway. He walked in, shrugged off his jacket, and kissed Mom absent-mindedly on the forehead. "Guess what?" she said, excitement in her voice. "Clara's team won regionals." She held up the certificate for him to see. Dad glanced at it, nodded once, and said, "That's good. Did you check the oil in your car this week?" The shift was immediate, like sunlight going behind a cloud. Mom's smile faltered. I muttered something about planning to check it tomorrow. The certificate drooped in my hand. Dad moved on, rummaging through the mail. Mom tried to fill the silence with clinking spoons and chatter about dinner. But in me, something hardened. You don't cry in front of a moment like that. You file it away in the drawer where you keep all the other proofs that you are a shadow. Michael came through the door a few minutes later, sweaty from practice, tossing his bag on the floor. "Coach said scouts might come to next Friday's game," he announced. Dad turned, eyes sharpening, the tiredness lifting off his shoulders. "Scouts," he repeated. "That's big, son." His voice carried the weight of fireworks. I stood there, certificate still in hand, invisible ink on my skin. I went to my room that night and pinned the paper on the corkboard above my desk. Beneath it hung other papers, essays, contest entries, a poem I wrote that had been printed in a small magazine. My wall was my private hall of fame, the only place my victories had the applause they deserved. Some children decorate their walls with posters of rock stars. I decorated mine with proof that I existed. The funny thing about growing up under constant comparison is that you start anticipating it before it happens. At birthdays, holidays, even at random family dinners, I would watch Dad's eyes. If they lingered on Michael, I braced myself. If they flicked to me briefly, I prepared to smile like I was satisfied with scraps. Eventually, I convinced myself this was normal, that families everywhere operated with such quiet hierarchies. But it wasn't normal. It was a slow erosion. There was the Christmas when I saved for months to buy Dad a leather-bound journal. He never wrote in it, but I thought maybe he would start. I wanted him to have a place to keep his thoughts since he never spoke them out loud. On Christmas morning, he opened it, nodded politely, and set it aside. A few minutes later, Michael handed him a signed baseball he'd bought off a teammate. Dad's face broke open into wonder. He held it up, turned it over in his hands like a relic, and thanked Michael 3 times. The journal ended up in a drawer untouched. Years later, after he died, I found it there, still blank. I stared at those empty pages and thought, this is what my relationship with him was. A book no one ever bothered to write. Yet, as much as it hurt, I couldn't stop craving his approval. That's the paradox of being the overlooked child. You build your life around proving you're enough, even to someone who has already decided otherwise. It's exhausting chasing shadows, but I did it anyway. I studied late into the nights, pushing myself to straight A's because maybe grades could speak louder than games. I joined every club I could manage, from yearbook committee to theater crew, because maybe effort could make me visible. I applied for scholarships, won some, lost more. Through it all, Dad remained steady, polite, unshaken. "Good job," he'd say, the same way he said, "pass the salt." And Michael, he glowed. He won championships, wore medals, and carried the easy charm of someone who never wondered if he belonged. Dad followed him like a faithful shadow, cheering at every game, recounting his stats to neighbors, bragging to relatives. Once, at a barbecue, I overheard Dad telling Uncle Rick, "Michael's got what it takes to lead." His voice swelled with pride. I was standing 3 feet away holding a tray of burgers. Neither of them noticed. It wasn't just Dad. The whole family played along. Relatives asked about Michael first, always first. Teachers compared us, coaches compared us, even Mom sometimes, though she tried to soften it. "You know your brother's just different," she'd say, as if difference were destiny. I nodded, smiled, swallowed the sting. I learned to laugh at jokes about being the responsible one. I wore that title like a shield. Responsible meant reliable, but also forgettable. Michael was the star. I was the steady flame in the background. Stars burn hot and fast. Flames keep the house warm. No one applauds the fireplace. But in the quiet corners of my heart, resentment grew. I hated myself for it. Resentment is an ugly thing, like rust on steel. It eats at you slowly, silently, until one day the structure of who you are feels brittle. Still, it was there. When Michael got into college on a scholarship, Dad wept with pride. When I got into mine, with loans I'd taken on myself, Dad said, "That's good. Make sure you budget carefully." Budget carefully. As if that was the headline of my life. Even in adulthood, the comparisons didn't end. Michael's Christmas cards came with glossy photos of him in uniform, arm around his fiancée, smiles wide. Mine came with scribbled notes about work, sometimes a pressed flower or doodle, because I never knew what else to send. Dad displayed Michael's cards on the mantel. Mine went in a drawer. There were moments I almost confronted him, times when the bitterness rose high in my throat when I wanted to shout, "Do you even see me? Do you even know me?" But the words died every time, because what if he answered honestly? What if the truth was no? So I swallowed my anger and wore my competence like armor. I built a life around being dependable, careful, sensible. People admired me for it. Friends called me grounded. Bosses called me reliable. I smiled, but inside I longed for a single reckless word of love from my father. Just once I wanted him to look at me the way he looked at Michael. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I didn't need it. But the truth was I carried that hunger like a secret flame. It warmed me in strange ways, even as it burned. And then, years later, when Dad died, that hunger turned into something else. Because hidden beneath the ashes of favoritism, buried under decades of silence, there was a truth none of us expected. A truth that would undo every story I'd told myself. But before I get there, you need to understand the weight of comparison. You need to feel it pressing on your chest, the way it pressed on mine, so you'll know how shocking it was when the scales finally tipped. For most of my life, I believed my father had one child he loved more. I was wrong. He had one child he trusted. And trust, I would learn, is a heavier, deeper kind of love. Silence has a way of becoming the wallpaper of a family. You don't notice it after a while. It blends into the background, subtle, almost decorative, until one day you realize that everything you thought was neutral has been quietly shaping you. My father's silence was like that, present in every room, every dinner, every ride in the car. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't violent. He was simply absent in a way that presence could disguise. I used to think his silence meant indifference, as though he had measured me and found me lacking. But as I grew older, I started to wonder if silence had been his only language. Maybe love for him was less about words and more about bolts tightened, tires checked, lights turned off at night. He grew up in a time when men were expected to speak little and prove much, when affection was a luxury that didn't survive the weight of bills and broken engines. His own father, my grandfather, had been a miner in the hills outside Pueblo. A man of dust and fatigue, who carried home blackened lungs and a face carved by years underground. Dad once told me his father never said, "I love you," not once. And yet he worked himself to collapse to keep food on the table. That, for my father, was what love looked like. Work as devotion. Provision as praise. Silence as survival. By the time he became a father himself, I think he believed he was doing right by repeating what he knew. But repetition is a strange inheritance. You don't always pass down strength. Sometimes you pass down wounds you never meant to. For me, the wound was absence. Dinner was always set at 6 sharp. Meat, potatoes, a vegetable, bread if Mom had baked that week. We ate with the television humming in the background, the nightly news filling the space our voices did not. Dad asked Michael about practice. He asked me if I'd finished my homework. His tone was steady, polite. He didn't ignore me. He simply didn't see beyond the basics. If Michael mentioned a new play, Dad's eyes lit. If I mentioned a book I was reading, Dad nodded, chewed his food, and reached for the salt. I learned to stop mentioning books. It's strange the ways we adapt. Children don't just accept silence, they learn to choreograph around it. I stopped asking him to come to my recitals. I stopped showing him my essays. Each time I withheld a piece of myself, it was like placing one more brick in a wall I swore I didn't want but somehow kept building. And he, maybe relieved not to be asked for something he didn't know how to give, let me. That was our unspoken agreement. I would shrink, he would retreat, and we would call it family. But roots always tell a deeper story. Dad belonged to a generation of men who believed sons carried the family name, the legacy, the duty. Daughters, in his eyes, were meant for gentleness, for quiet pursuits, for futures tied to someone else's last name. He loved me, I don't doubt that now, but he didn't know what to do with me. I wasn't Michael. I wasn't the heir to his silent empire of hard work and steady endurance. I was the daughter who wanted conversation, acknowledgement, presence. To him, those were luxuries, not necessities. Luxuries he thought I would get elsewhere. This is not to excuse him, only to understand him. There were flashes, brief and almost imperceptible, that hinted at what lay under his silence. Once, when I was 12, I fell off my bike on the cracked sidewalk near our house. Blood streaked down my knee, bright and startling. Dad came running faster than I'd ever seen him move. He lifted me in his arms, carried me inside, and cleaned the wound with a gentleness that didn't match his calloused hands. He didn't say much, just hold still. Almost done. You're okay. But his hands shook as he wrapped the bandage. For a moment, I thought I saw something raw on his face, something like fear. Then it was gone, tucked back under the weight of being steady. Later, at dinner, he asked Michael about the game and asked me about my homework. And the silence went on. That's the cruelty of those rare glimpses. They make you believe there's more, that maybe next time the silence will crack and love will pour out. But mostly it doesn't. Mostly you are left with memory scraps, trying to stitch them into proof. As I grew older, the silence turned into distance. When I was in high school, Dad started spending longer hours at work. He was a supervisor at a construction supply yard, a job that demanded both his body and his patience. He left before dawn, came home after dark. Dinner conversations grew shorter. Sometimes Michael would stay up with him, talking about sports or girls or future plans. I would sit nearby, pretending to read, listening for any sign he wanted me in that circle. He never said no, but he never said yes. So I became fluent in another language, the language of omission. I learned what not to say, what not to ask, where not to stand. If Michael was telling a story, I stepped back. If Dad was tired, I didn't burden him with my own day. I became self-contained, quiet, responsible, and everyone praised me for it. Teachers loved how dependable I was. Friends admired my composure. Even Dad occasionally said, "You're good at handling yourself." But handling yourself is not the same as being held. Looking back, I realize how many choices I made because of that silence. I didn't pursue music, even though I loved it, because no one in the family seemed to care. I chose a practical major in college, not because it thrilled me, but because I knew it would make sense to him. I measured my steps against the invisible yardstick of his approval, even as I told myself I didn't need it. That's the paradox of being a daughter raised in silence. You spend your whole life pretending you don't care, while every decision whispers that you do. The roots of silence stretch farther than we think. They reach into friendships, relationships, even the way you talk to yourself. I found it hard to trust praise. Compliments slid off me like water on stone. If someone said I was talented, I thought they were being polite. If someone said I was beautiful, I assumed they were mistaken. Silence had taught me to doubt anything too kind, too warm. It had trained me to believe love was something you earned, not something you received freely. And so, like my father, I became quiet, not in words, those I had plenty of, but in emotions. I hid them even from myself. I dated men who admired my steadiness, not men who saw my hunger. I excelled at work, but rarely spoke about my ambitions. I played the role of the calm, dependable friend, never the one who asked for help. People leaned on me, and I let them, because being leaned on was the closest I got to being needed. In this way, my father lived inside me long before I realized it. His silence had become mine. But silence is not empty. It's full of what could have been said, what should have been said, what was too heavy or too tender to say. Silence carries memory like a locked box, and when he died, that box cracked open. The letters, the trust, the truth he had hidden, they revealed a man I had not known, a father I had misjudged. Still, to understand the weight of that revelation, you need to know how deep the silence went, how many years it stretched across, how many birthdays were marked by nods instead of words, how many holidays were filled with toasts for Michael and quiet smiles for me. You need to know the loneliness of growing up in a house where love was present but muted, where devotion was steady but unsaid, where silence grew like ivy over every window until you couldn't see out. That was my inheritance. That was the root of who I became. And maybe that's why, when the truth finally surfaced, it broke me open in ways I couldn't have predicted. Silence had been my cage, but it was also, strangely, my preparation. Because trust, deep, enduring trust, lives closer to silence than to noise. And when I learned I was the only one he trusted, the years of quiet suddenly made sense. But that is still ahead. For now, what you need to carry with you is this. Silence is never neutral. It shapes. It wounds. It teaches. It becomes the soil where you grow. And the roots of mine ran straight back to my father and the man who had raised him and the men before them. Generations of silence passed down like heirlooms until me. And I, unknowingly, was the one chosen to break it. Silence grew like vines in our house, tangling itself around every interaction until you couldn't tell whether it had been planted intentionally or just left unchecked for too long. When I think of my father now, I don't remember a lack of presence. He was always there, steady as the mountains in the distance. What I remember was the way his presence carried no bridge to cross. He was a figure seen but not touched, heard but never fully listened to, close but unreachable. There were entire weekends when our family existed like 4 planets in the same orbit, circling but never colliding. Saturday mornings, Michael and Dad left early for practice, the thump of cleats on the porch, steps marking their departure. Mom puttered in the kitchen, humming while she prepared lists for the week. I stayed in my room, practicing piano or reading novels with the door closed, the music or the words wrapping around me like insulation. Hours would pass before any of us spoke more than a handful of sentences to each other. If you measured family in words, we were poor. But if you measured family in effort, Dad thought we were rich. I often wondered if he confused responsibility with intimacy. He kept the roof solid, the car running, the bills paid. He salted the driveway in winter, mowed the lawn in summer, and showed up at work even on days his back stiffened like iron. In his world, these were the definitions of love: consistency, provision, reliability. What he didn't understand, or perhaps didn't allow himself to understand, was that children don't crave consistency first. They crave connection. And connection needs words, eyes, softness. None of which came easily to him. I once tried to force it. I was 14, restless with a hunger I couldn't name. One evening, Dad was sitting in his chair, reading the paper, the lamplight spilling across the newsprint. I perched on the arm of the couch beside him, clutching a notebook filled with poems I had been writing. They weren't good, what teenage poems ever are. But they were honest, raw, filled with all the feelings I couldn't speak aloud. I wanted him to see me, not the quiet daughter who handled herself, but the person burning behind the silence. "Dad," I said, voice tentative, "can I read you something?" He glanced up from the paper, eyebrows raised as though I had interrupted a sermon. "What is it?" "A poem," I said. My cheeks burned. He hesitated, folded the paper, set it on his lap. "Go ahead." So I read. My voice trembled at first, but I pushed through, each word carrying more urgency than the last. When I finished, I looked at him, desperate for something: praise, critique, even laughter. He nodded once, the same nod he gave to passing neighbors. "That's nice," he said. Then he reached for the paper again. I sat there, my notebook heavy in my hands, and felt the silence press down like a lid on a jar. Nice. That was the word you used for a neighbor's hedge or a pie someone brought to a potluck, not for a piece of your child's soul. I never read him another poem. Mom tried to fill the gaps, but even she lived within the same system. She'd tell me she was proud, that I was talented, that I had gifts Michael didn't. But she said it softly in the kitchen when Dad wasn't around, almost like it was a secret between women, something fragile that couldn't survive in the open air of my father's silence. I came to understand that affirmation was private, while comparison was public. Michael got his applause in daylight. I received my crumbs in shadows. And yet I still loved him. That was the hardest part. I loved the way his boots by the door smelled faintly of sawdust. I loved the way his laugh, rare as it was, filled the house with warmth for a few seconds, like the furnace kicking on in winter. I loved how he whistled while shaving, off-key but persistent. These small things became my proofs, my evidence that he wasn't entirely unreachable. But love without language is a puzzle missing too many pieces. You know what it's supposed to be, but you can't see the whole picture. By college, the silence had hardened into distance. I called home every Sunday as Mom requested. She asked about classes, about friends, about the weather. Dad rarely took the phone. If he did, his words were brief. "You good on money? Keep your grades up. Call your mother more often." Those were his pillars of fatherhood, and he believed they were enough. Michael, meanwhile, got calls throughout the week. They discussed games, prospects, possibilities. Dad told him about the new shed he was building, the tools he'd bought, the projects they'd tackle together when Michael came home. I heard about these conversations secondhand, in family updates, the way you hear about a party you weren't invited to. It wasn't just what was said, it was what wasn't. In 20 years of calls, he never once asked me how I was really doing. Not once. And yet I kept answering questions he never asked. I told him I was fine, work was fine, life was fine. I constructed a facade of competence because that was the only language he recognized. But silence doesn't just wound, it teaches. It taught me to be invisible when I needed help. It taught me to carry burdens alone. It taught me that longing for connection could feel like weakness. And so, when relationships came, I repeated the same patterns. I chose men who spoke in half sentences, who offered presence without intimacy, who mirrored my father's stoic detachment. I mistook silence for stability, absence for strength. It took me years to realize I wasn't seeking love, I was reenacting it. That's the thing about roots. They anchor you, but they also bind you. They hold you steady, but they can also choke your growth. The roots of my father's silence reached so deep into me that I didn't know where he ended and I began. Looking back, I wonder if he ever noticed, if he ever lay awake at night, realizing he didn't know his daughter the way he knew his son. I'll never know, he never said, and maybe he didn't know how. But I do know this, silence is inherited. Passed down from father to son, from parent to child, like an heirloom no one asks for but everyone carries. My father's father had given it to him. He gave it to me. And without meaning to, I started carrying it forward, too. What changed everything, what cracked the roots wide open, was his death. Death has a way of breaking silence, of scattering it like dust. When the lawyer read his will, when I found the letters he'd hidden, when I realized I was the one he trusted, it was like discovering a secret map of his heart, drawn in invisible ink. Suddenly, the years of silence rearranged themselves into something else, something almost holy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that revelation, there was only the silence, thick and deep and generational. And I lived inside it like a house with no windows, teaching myself to breathe air that never really moved. If you've lived in silence too, you know what I mean. You know the weight of it, the way it becomes both your cage and your armor. You know how it shapes you, sharpens you, scars you. And maybe, like me, you've wondered if it will always be that way. For years, I thought so. For years, I believed silence was my destiny. That I would carry it into every relationship, every decision, every corner of my life. I didn't know yet that silence, once broken, can reveal truths louder than any words. And the truth my father left behind, the trust he placed in me, would shatter everything I thought I knew about him, about Michael, about myself. But for now, let this stand. Silence is never empty. It is filled with roots, with history, with inheritance, and mine ran deep, too deep, until the day they were finally pulled up into the light. If silence was the wallpaper of our house, misunderstanding was the furniture. It filled every room, shaped where we sat, how we moved, even what we avoided. I didn't just believe my father didn't love me as much as Michael. I built my whole identity around it. It became the compass I used to navigate every decision. When you tell yourself a story long enough, it becomes the truth, even if it isn't. By my late 20s, that story had hardened into fact. I was not the favorite. I was not chosen. I was tolerated, respected in a polite way, but never cherished. The evidence seemed irrefutable. Every photograph on the mantel was of Michael, throwing a ball, holding a trophy, smiling with a girlfriend. If I appeared at all, it was usually at the edge, blurred, as though even the camera didn't know where to focus. I carried those images with me into adulthood. They became the pictures I saw in my mind whenever I thought of Dad. Not his face, not his voice, but the space I occupied, or didn't, in the family portrait. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular, years before he died. Michael had just come home from a minor league season, wearing a jacket with his team's logo stitched proudly across the chest. He walked in carrying a duffel bag like a soldier returning from war, and Dad beamed as though the entire world had come home in that bag. "Look at you," he said, clapping Michael on the shoulder, "my boy." I was already there setting the table with Mom. He barely looked at me. During dinner, conversation revolved around Michael's stats, his travel stories, his prospects. I sat quietly, spooning mashed potatoes onto plates, listening to laughter and applause that had nothing to do with me. At one point, Mom tried to pivot the topic. "Clara's doing well at work," she said softly, almost apologetically. "She just got promoted to account manager." Dad nodded, eyes still fixed on Michael. "That's good," he said. Then, turning back to my brother, "Tell me about that home run you hit in June." And that was it. My promotion, months of work, brushed aside like a leaf in the wind. I excused myself after dessert and sat on the porch, wrapping my coat tighter around me. The night air was sharp with autumn, stars scattered across the sky. I heard the clatter of dishes inside, the low hum of Dad's voice, Michael's laugh. And for the first time, I whispered the truth I had been swallowing for years. He doesn't love me. That whisper turned into a mantra. I repeated it in quiet moments, walking home from work, brushing my teeth, staring at the ceiling at night. Each repetition made it heavier, more permanent. It was easier to believe it than to keep hoping for something that never came. And yet, hope is stubborn. Even as I told myself the story of being unloved, some part of me kept searching for cracks in it. Little gestures I could interpret differently, signs that maybe I was wrong. Once, Dad fixed the heater in my apartment while I was at work. I came home to find the place warm for the first time in weeks. On the kitchen table was a note in his cramped handwriting. "Filter was clogged, should be fine now." I stared at that note for a long time. Was it love? Or was it just another act of responsibility, his way of maintaining order in the world? I couldn't decide. In the end, I folded it and tucked it into a drawer, as if preserving evidence for a trial that would never come. The misunderstanding wasn't just about him. It was about me. I believed I was unworthy of being seen, that something in me lacked whatever magic Michael carried. Maybe it was beauty, or charm, or ambition. Maybe it was the way he could light up a room while I preferred to observe from the corner. I told myself I wasn't broken exactly, but I was unfinished, a sketch left in pencil while Michael had been painted in full color. That belief seeped into every relationship I had. Friends leaned on me, but rarely celebrated me. Boyfriends admired my steadiness, but left me for women who dazzled. I thought it was fate, but it was really just the echo of my misunderstanding. I carried my father's silence into every corner of my life, and then blamed him when it followed me. The hardest part was how convincing it all seemed. When you live in the shadow of someone else's spotlight, You don't just feel unseen, you start to believe you deserve it. I told myself I wasn't the kind of person people celebrated. I was the supporting role, the stagey hand, the one who made sure the lights turned on but never stood under them. That was my place. And Dad, I thought, had confirmed it 1,000 times over. I didn't realize then how much of it was a misunderstanding, that his silence wasn't absence, but restraint, that his lack of words wasn't lack of love, but lack of practice, that his pride in Michael didn't mean he wasn't proud of me. He just didn't know how to say it in a language I understood. But in those years before his death, I couldn't see that. All I saw was a father who gave everything to a son and nothing to a daughter. All I felt was the sting of being overlooked. All I knew was that if trust or love existed, it surely lived on Michael's side of the table, not mine. And so I lived with the misunderstanding, wore it like a second skin, let it dictate the rhythm of my life. It wasn't until Dad's final act, the will, the letters, the trust, that I realized the story I had been telling myself was never the whole truth. But misunderstanding is powerful. It can shape a lifetime. It can make you walk away from love that was quietly holding you the whole time. It can blind you to the truth even when it's sitting right across the dinner table, nodding, asking if you're good on gas. At the time, though, I didn't know any of this. I only knew the ache of invisibility, the certainty that I was unloved, and the slow resignation that this was my lot in life. And so, when Dad died, I braced myself for confirmation. I expected the will to prove what I had always believed, that Michael was the favorite, the chosen one, the heir. I prepared for my final humiliation, the last stamp of approval denied. What I wasn't prepared for was the truth. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I remember because it was the kind of day that begins in routine, and routine has a way of fooling you into thinking nothing monumental could possibly happen. I had just poured coffee into my travel mug, the steam rising in lazy spirals when the phone rang. Mom's voice was strange, flat as though every ounce of air had been pressed out of her. "Clara," she said, "your father, he's gone." 2 words, "he's gone," can collapse 32 years of misunderstanding. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to tilt. I held the mug too tightly, my knuckles blanching, the coffee trembling on the rim. I asked her to repeat it as though saying it again might change its shape, but it didn't. It only grew heavier. "He had a heart attack," she explained, her words clipped, mechanical. "At work, they tried, but it was quick. Quick, as though quickness was a mercy, as though a life could be measured in how efficiently it ended." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mug in my hands. The coffee had gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. I thought of all the mornings Dad had risen before dawn, the sound of the coffee maker sputtering in our old kitchen. He liked his coffee black, bitter, unadorned. The kind of coffee that tasted like work. I wondered if he had taken a sip that morning before his heart betrayed him. Grief doesn't arrive in a straight line. It comes in fragments, in flashes. That morning, I felt none of the expected sadness, only a hollow space where words should have been. The silence he had left behind seemed to echo louder than his death. The days leading up to the funeral blurred together. Michael flew in, polished and composed, the weight of his jacket hanging heavy on his shoulders. He hugged me in the airport parking lot, his cologne sharp, his voice steady. "We'll get through this," he said, as though grief were a game to be won. At home, Mom moved through the house like a ghost. She folded Dad's clothes, straightened the papers on his desk, arranged photographs on the mantel as if preparing a shrine. I watched her hands tremble when she touched his glasses, left on the nightstand as though he might return for them. The funeral itself was everything I expected and nothing I was ready for. The church filled with neighbors, co-workers, relatives. Men from the yard where he worked sat in the pews with calloused hands clasped, eyes downcast. Women from the neighborhood brought casseroles, murmured condolences, pressed tissues into our palms. Michael delivered the eulogy, Of course he did. He stood at the pulpit, tall and confident, his voice carrying across the sanctuary. He spoke of Dad's work ethic, his devotion to family, his pride in his son's achievements. People nodded, dabbed their eyes, whispered, "What a fine young man." I sat in the front row, hands clenched in my lap, listening to my father's life reduced to bullet points. No mention of the nights he drove me to school plays, or the time he taught me how to change a tire in the driveway. No acknowledgement of the daughter who had sat at the kitchen table with him for years, waiting for words that never came. When it was over, we walked behind the casket to the cemetery, the winter air biting at our faces. I watched as the coffin lowered into the ground, the finality of it sinking into me like stones in water. People tossed flowers. I tossed silence. Afterward, in the quiet of the house, we gathered in the living room. The lawyer, a man with thinning hair and a solemn voice, spread papers across the coffee table. "Your father left a will," he said. I braced myself. Here it was, the final confirmation. Michael would inherit everything, the house, the savings, the land. I would be left with polite words and perhaps a piece of jewelry, something sentimental but inconsequential. That was the story I had written in my head for years, and I was ready for it to be proven true. The lawyer cleared his throat. "To my son, Michael," he began, "I leave my baseball glove. May it remind you of the games we shared." I glanced at Michael. His jaw tightened. He had expected more. The lawyer continued. "To my daughter, Clara, I leave the house, the savings, and the deeds to the land. Everything else in my possession is also hers." The room fell silent. Even silence, which had always been the language of our family, seemed stunned. I blinked, certain I had misheard. "What?" I whispered. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "It's all here in his handwriting. He wanted you to have everything." Michael shifted in his seat, his face flushing. "That doesn't make sense," he said sharply. "Dad always said I'd take care of things. He always," his voice cracked. "He trusted me, but the papers told a different story." I stared at the lawyer, at the neat signatures, at the undeniable proof. My father, the man who had spent a lifetime in silence, had spoken in the only way he knew how, in ink, in finality, in trust. He had left it all to me. The misunderstanding I had carried for decades shattered in that moment. All those years of believing I was unloved, unseen, unwanted, gone in a single sentence. I wasn't the shadow. I wasn't the afterthought. I was the one he trusted, the one he had counted on when words failed him. But revelation is a double-edged sword. It heals, but it also wounds. Because as I sat there, the weight of his trust pressing down on me, I realized something else. I would never have the chance to ask him why. Never have the chance to hear him say the words I had longed for. His love had been written into legal documents, not spoken aloud. And that was both everything and not enough. Michael stormed out of the room, anger sharp in his steps. Mom sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, tears slipping down her cheeks. I held the papers, my hands shaking, the weight of inheritance heavier than I could have imagined. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I spread the will across the desk where I had once done my homework. I traced the lines of his signature, the loops and strokes I had seen 1,000 times on permission slips and report cards. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe what I had never dared. My father loved me. Not in the way I wanted, not in the way I understood, but in the way he knew how. The misunderstanding had defined my life. But now, in death, he had redefined it. Still, questions lingered. Why me? Why everything? Why trust the daughter he had never seemed to see? The answers I would discover were waiting in the letters he left behind. But that is the next part of the story. For now, hold this moment with me. A daughter at her father's funeral, clutching papers that carried both love and burden, realizing the story she had told herself her whole life was never the truth at all. Grief is a strange roommate. It moves into your life uninvited, takes up space in every room, and refuses to leave. After the funeral, I wandered through the house like someone in a museum where every exhibit belonged to me, and yet felt foreign. The couch where he used to fall asleep watching the evening news. The kitchen chair worn smooth where he sat every morning with his coffee. The boots by the door, one lace frayed, dust from the yard still clinging to the soles. Mom had retreated into her own silence, the kind that was heavy with exhaustion. Michael left after a few days, his departure sharp and abrupt, as though leaving quickly could erase the sting of what the will had revealed. That left me alone in the house with my father's belongings, his ghost tucked into every drawer. It was in those drawers that I began to find him. The first discovery happened almost by accident. I was cleaning his desk, an old oak piece scarred with scratches and coffee rings. The top drawer stuck as it always had, but after tugging a few times, I pried it open. Inside were stacks of envelopes bundled neatly with rubber bands that had grown brittle. Each one was labeled in his cramped handwriting. Clara, 1998. Clara, 2002. Clara, 2007. My breath caught. I pulled one free, trembling. The envelope was sealed but unaddressed. I slid a finger under the flap, careful not to tear it, and unfolded the paper inside. Clara, it began, you were 12 today. I wanted to tell you how proud I am, but the words didn't come out. You looked so grown up, playing that piano piece at the recital. I sat in the back, didn't want to embarrass you. You didn't see me, but I was there. I always am. I pressed the paper to my chest, tears blurring the ink. He had been there. The recital I thought he'd missed, the one where I played Debussy under the dim lights, staring into an audience where I thought he was absent. He had been there, hiding in the back, watching silently. I had mistaken invisibility for absence. I opened another letter. Clara, your essay came in the mail. Mom showed me. You have a gift with words. I don't always know how to respond when you show me these things, but I save them. Don't think my silence means I don't care. It just means I don't have the right words. One after another, the letters revealed what he had never spoken. His pride in my writing, his awe at my music, his quiet observations of moments I thought had gone unnoticed. The time I helped a neighbor carry groceries, the way I read books under the porch light, the way I took care of Mom when she was sick. He had seen it all. I spent hours at that desk, surrounded by envelopes, the papers spread out like a mosaic of hidden love. Each letter was a bridge across the years of silence, a proof that his absence of words was not absence of feeling. He had trusted me enough to record these thoughts, to leave them where only I would find them. One letter in particular undid me. Clara, if you're reading this, it means I didn't say enough while I was alive. You were never second place. Michael was the noise, but you were the music. I trusted you with my heart because you carried it gently, even when you thought I wasn't watching. That's why the will is what it is. I know you'll do right. You always have. I read that line again and again. Michael was the noise, but you were the music. All my life, I had believed music was the thing that separated us, that he didn't understand it, didn't value it, didn't see me through it. But in the end, music had been the metaphor he chose to describe me, the language he used when his own words failed. I wept until the pages blurred, the paper damp in my hands. The discovery didn't erase the years of pain. It didn't magically undo the nights I spent wondering why I wasn't enough, the birthdays overshadowed, the holidays where my achievements went unnoticed. But it reframed them. It showed me that love had been present, quiet and steady, like an underground river I never knew flowed beneath me. In the days that followed, I searched through every corner of the house. In the attic, I found a box labeled Clara's Things. Inside were programs from my school plays, newspaper clippings of contests I'd won, even the ribbon from that essay competition I thought he had thrown away. He hadn't discarded it. He had preserved it, hidden in a place I never thought to look. In the garage, I found a shelf where he had kept jars of screws and bolts, each labeled meticulously. Tucked among them was a smaller jar filled not with hardware, but with ticket stubs. Movies I had dragged him to when I was a teenager. Concerts he had attended reluctantly, even a stub from the first piano recital I had begged him to come to. He had kept them all. Every discovery was another crack in the misunderstanding that had defined my life. The man I thought hadn't cared had been watching, collecting, remembering. He just didn't know how to show it in the moment. Trust was the thread that wove through it all. He trusted me to carry responsibility, to notice the small things, to hold the family together when others faltered. He trusted me with his estate, with his legacy, with the words he couldn't say. And now, in death, he trusted me to forgive the silence and understand the love buried beneath it. But trust is heavy. He hadn't given me these letters while he was alive. He had left them as an inheritance, a puzzle to solve when he was gone. I couldn't ask him why. I couldn't tell him I had misunderstood. I couldn't give him the reassurance that his silence had wounded me less once I saw the truth. I had only pages and the ache of words that arrived too late. Still, those pages changed me. I began to see my father everywhere, in the quiet gestures of strangers, in the steady patience of coworkers, in the way I myself hesitated before speaking. I noticed how often I chose silence over vulnerability, how often I mirrored him. But instead of resenting it, I began to understand it as a form of trust I could reshape. I started writing letters of my own, not to send, but to keep. Letters to him, to myself, to the child I once was. Letters that said the things I had always wanted to hear. You are enough. I see you. I am proud. It felt like planting seeds in soil that had been barren for years. Slowly, new life began to grow. One evening, I sat on the porch with Mom, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. She was quiet, her hands folded in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "He loved you, Clara. You know that now, don't you?" I nodded, tears stinging. "Yes," I whispered, "but I wish I'd known it then." She sighed. "Your father wasn't good with words, but he was good with trust, and trust is its own kind of love." I leaned against her shoulder, the weight of years settling between us. She was right. Love doesn't always look like applause or speeches. Sometimes it looks like a drawer full of letters, a box in the attic, a will that leaves everything not to the golden child, but to the one who thought she was invisible. And in that realization, something inside me shifted. The silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like a cocoon, broken open too late, but broken nonetheless. For the first time in my life, I no longer defined myself by being the unfavored child. I was the trusted one, the keeper of his quiet love, the inheritor not just of his estate, but of his unspoken faith in me. And with that inheritance came responsibility, to honor it, to live differently, to speak the words he never could, because if silence could wound generations, maybe words could heal them. The house was quiet after the discoveries. The letters sat in neat stacks on the desk, each one a voice from the past speaking into my present. For days, I reread them, tracing the handwriting as though my fingertips could bring my father back. Each word pulled me deeper into the realization that I had never truly been invisible. I had simply been loved in a language I didn't understand until it was almost too late. That knowledge reshaped me. Slowly, steadily, it loosened the knots of resentment that had bound me for years. The anger I had carried toward my father softened into sorrow, and then into gratitude. Gratitude that he had seen me all along, that he had chosen me to carry his legacy, that he had trusted me when I hadn't even trusted myself. Michael didn't take it well. For weeks, he refused to speak to me. He called the will unfair, accused me of manipulating Dad, insisted there must have been a mistake. His anger was sharp, like a knife that cut both of us. But beneath it, I saw something else. Hurt that the pedestal he had been given all his life had crumbled. hurt that the father who had cheered the loudest for him had in the end handed the keys of trust to me. At first, I wanted to defend myself, to argue, to prove. But the letters had taught me something silence never could. Sometimes words don't fix what trust can, so instead I listened. When Michael shouted, I let him. When he accused, I didn't fight back. When his voice broke and he whispered, "Why not me?" I said only, "I don't know, but I don't think it means he loved you less." Because that was the truth I had come to understand. My father's trust in me didn't cancel his love for Michael. It only revealed a different facet of it. One son had been his pride, the other his noise. But the daughter, me, I had been his anchor. And perhaps in the end he knew pride and noise would fade, but anchors endure. Time softened Michael too. He began to call again, halting at first, then more often. We spoke about Dad, about childhood, about the misunderstandings we had both carried. I admitted the jealousy I had felt. He admitted the pressure of always being the favorite, how heavy it had been to never feel allowed to fail. We discovered that both of us had been living in different prisons built by the same father, and in a strange way, that realization set us free. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in small acts, sitting together at the kitchen table, sorting through Dad's tools, walking through the yard, pointing out the projects he had left unfinished, laughing over the quirks we had inherited, Michael with his stubbornness, me with my quiet pauses before speaking. Each moment stitched something back together that silence had torn apart. But the greatest healing came inside me. For the first time, I stopped measuring myself against Michael. I stopped chasing approval that was never going to come in the way I expected. Instead, I began to live in the trust my father had left me. I managed the estate, cared for Mom, kept the house alive with warmth. Every act felt like a conversation with him, as if I were finally fluent in his language. I also learned to speak differently in my own life. I stopped hiding behind competence. I started telling friends how much they meant to me. I told coworkers when I was proud of them. I looked in the mirror and on good days said, "I see you, Clara." It felt awkward at first, but slowly it became natural. Words, I discovered, are bridges, and I didn't want the people I loved to inherit silence the way I had. One evening, months after the funeral, I sat on the porch watching the sky melt into colors, pink, gold, deep violet. The same porch where I had once whispered that my father didn't love me. Now I whispered something different. "Thank you, Dad, for the trust, for the quiet love, for teaching me, even in silence, that I was never truly invisible. Life doesn't always give us the love we want in the form we expect. Sometimes it gives us silence, and we mistake it for neglect. Sometimes it gives us responsibility, and we mistake it for burden. Sometimes it gives us trust, and we only realize years later that trust is the deepest form of love there is. That is the lesson I carry now, to listen for the love beneath the silence, to recognize trust as its own language, to break the cycle by speaking the words my father couldn't, and to forgive, not because silence didn't hurt, but because love, once understood, is stronger than the wounds it leaves. So this is how my story ends, or rather, how it continues. A daughter once convinced she was second place, now finally at peace with the truth. I was always trusted. And trust, I've learned, is more enduring than favoritism, louder than silence, and stronger than misunderstanding. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I hope my story reminds you that love can exist even when it isn't spoken, and that trust is sometimes the greatest inheritance of all. I wish you and your family health, peace, and happiness. And if this story has touched you, if it has given you even a small moment of reflection, I would be honored if you stayed with me for more. You can subscribe here, not as a formality, but as a way for us to keep sharing these stories together. Because in the end, stories are how we break silence. And every story, like every life, deserves to be heard.